Russia's oil empire is on fire. Not as a metaphor, not as a headline, literally, physically on fire. Refineries gutted, storage terminals collapsed into black columns of smoke, pipeline infrastructure that took decades to build converted into twisted steel in the span of a single operation. And here is what the mainstream coverage is not telling you. This is not a series of lucky strikes. This is not improvisation. What you are watching is the systematic demolition of the logistical and industrial foundation that Russia's entire war economy depends on, executed by a Ukrainian strike architecture that has quietly, methodically evolved far beyond anything the Kremlin believed it was capable of. Let that land for a moment, because the question is not whether Ukraine hit something valuable. The question is whether Russia can survive the depth, the tempo, and the strategic logic of what is now being done to it at medium range. And the answer, when you pull this apart at the doctrinal levels, is no, not in any time frame that matters for this war. What you are about to hear is not a summary of recent news. It is a structural analysis of why Russia's energy logistics architecture was always the correct target, why it took this long to hit it systematically, why the Kremlin's response reveals exactly the degree of panic it is trying to conceal, and why the acceleration of these strikes marks one of the most consequential strategic shifts of the entire conflict. Stay with me, because by the time we are done, you will understand not just what happened, you will understand why it was always going to happen, and why the people running this war in Moscow should have seen it coming years ago. Let us go back to the beginning, not the beginning of the war, the beginning of the assumption. Because what is being destroyed on those burning terminals is not just physical infrastructure, it is a doctrine. It is the accumulated weight of a belief that Russia built into every strategic calculation it made before February 2022 and every calculation it made after. The belief was this: Russia's depth is its armor. The belief was that the sheer geographic mass of the Russian Federation, its distances, its redundancy, its industrial sprawl across 11 time zones, made it functionally invulnerable to economic or logistical attrition from a smaller, weaker adversary. Russia had done the math, or so it believed. Ukraine did not have the reach. Ukraine did not have the munitions. Ukraine did not have the institutional capacity to prosecute a sustained precision strike campaign against targets hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory. Therefore, Russia's rear areas were safe. The refineries were safe. The fuel depots were safe. The pipeline networks were safe. And if they were safe, Russia could wage attritional warfare indefinitely, grinding forward, absorbing Western weapons deliveries, outlasting Ukrainian manpower, and presenting the world with a fait accompli before any threshold of real pain was crossed. That assumption is now rubble. It did not collapse overnight. Understanding how it collapsed requires understanding the specific arc of Ukraine's strike development, because this is a story about adaptation under fire, and that story has distinct chapters that mainstream coverage almost never narrates with the precision it requires. In the early months of the conflict, Ukraine's long-range strike capability was, by any honest military assessment, limited. Ballistic missiles, artillery adapted for deep fires, a handful of Soviet-era platforms, modified with new guidance packages. The reach was there in theory. The volume, the precision, and the operational integration were not. Ukraine was striking, but it was not yet campaigning. There is a critical difference between those two things at the strategic level. Striking is episodic. Campaigning is systematic. A campaign implies a target hierarchy, a damage assessment cycle, a restrike logic, and a theory of effect that connects individual strikes to a cumulative strategic outcome. What Ukraine lacked in 2022 was not courage or intent. It was the infrastructure of campaigning at depth. That infrastructure was built over the course of 2023 and into 2024, and the mechanism by which it was built is itself a doctrinal lesson that Western militaries will be studying for the next 2 decades. Ukraine did not wait for permission. It did not wait for a single transformative weapon system to arrive and solve the problem for it. It assembled capability in layers, integrating domestic drone production, adapted cruise systems, Western-supplied platforms, and, critically, a targeting intelligence architecture that became progressively more sophisticated with each strike cycle. By late 2023, Ukrainian strike planning had evolved from individual target selection to something far more dangerous: networked effect sequencing, the ability to hit not just a refinery, but the right refinery at the right time, in combination with disruptions to the supply chain that refinery served, in a sequence designed to cascade rather than merely damage. And here's the first place that Russian doctrine failed structurally. Russia's military-industrial model was not designed for resilience against precisely sequenced attrition. It was designed for mass production under simplified logistics, the legacy of a Soviet system that prized throughput over redundancy. When you hit a node in that system, the system does not reroute efficiently. It degrades. And when you hit multiple nodes in sequence, the degradation compounds in ways that Russian planners had never modeled against a persistent, adaptive opponent with growing reach. Pull the lens back and understand what this means at the operational level. Every barrel of fuel that does not reach the front because a refinery was struck is a tank that moves fewer kilometers, an artillery piece that fires fewer rounds, a logistics convoy that turns around short of its delivery point. Fuel is not a commodity in this war. Fuel is combat power measured and rationed and ultimately limited by what can be processed, stored, and delivered. Ukraine understood this. Russia incredibly appears to have underestimated how thoroughly Ukraine had internalized it. Now the lens widens further, because what changed in the most recent phase is not just the frequency of strikes or the size of the platforms employed. What changed is the reach architecture itself. Medium-range strike capability, the ability to reliably, accurately engage targets at distances that had previously been considered operationally prohibitive, has been extended in ways that the Kremlin's threat assessments did not adequately project. And this matters in ways that are not simply geographic. Every kilometer of additional reach that Ukraine achieves does not add linearly to its targeting options. It adds exponentially, because Russian infrastructure was not distributed with the assumption of deep, precise, sustained attack. It was distributed with the assumption that depth equaled safety. Every additional kilometer of Ukrainian reach strips away that assumption across a wider and wider band of Russian territory. Refineries that were considered untouchable 6 months ago are now inside the operational envelope. Storage facilities that served as the last resort fuel reserve for entire military districts are now within range. And the targeting intelligence that Ukraine has built, the network of satellites, human sources, open source indicators, and pattern of life analysis that now feeds its strike planning, means that reaching those targets is no longer the primary constraint. What happens next changes everything, because we are now entering the phase of this campaign where the effects begin to compound in real time, where each successive strike does not merely destroy a discrete piece of infrastructure, but degrades Russia's ability to respond to, repair, or replace the previous strikes. This is the dynamic that military planners call cascading attrition, and it is what separates a degradation campaign from a destruction campaign. Destruction is episodic. You hit something, it burns, and the adversary adapts around it. Cascading attrition is systemic. You hit something, it burns, and the adversary's ability to adapt is itself impaired by the next strike and the next and the next, until the system's repair cycle falls permanently behind its degradation cycle. Russia is now inside that dynamic. The evidence is not subtle. In the weeks following the most recent series of large-scale strikes, Russian fuel logistics in multiple operational sectors showed measurable disruption indicators. Reduced delivery frequency, evidence of drawdown from reserve stocks that Russia had previously kept intact precisely for crisis periods, and most tellingly, the beginning of fuel substitution patterns at the forward logistics echelon. That last indicator matters most, because it tells you something specific about how deep the disruption has penetrated the supply chain. When forward units begin accepting lower-grade fuel substitutes or reduced delivery volumes, it is not because the decision was made casually at the rear. It is because the rear no longer has the capacity to deliver what the front requires. The cascade has reached the point where it is visible in operational behavior, not just in satellite imagery of burning terminals. And it gets even more serious from here because the oil infrastructure dimension of this campaign is not operating in isolation. It is operating in concert with two other pressure vectors that the Kremlin is being forced to manage simultaneously, neither of which it can address with the resources it would have available if the oil infrastructure were intact. The first is the fiscal dimension. Russia's federal budget is structurally dependent on hydrocarbon revenue in a way that has been extensively documented, but is still insufficiently appreciated in Western strategic analysis. When a refinery is destroyed, Russia does not simply lose the throughput of that refinery, it loses the export capacity that refinery served, the taxable revenue that export generated, and through the sanctions architecture now binding Russia's oil sector, the financial cushion that allowed Moscow to continue funding its military operations without making choices between guns and butter that would have become politically visible. Every barrel of oil that cannot be processed and exported is a hole in a federal budget that is already operating under conditions of extreme constraint. The hole gets larger with each successful strike cycle. The second pressure vector is the maintenance and repair constraint. Russian refining capacity was already operating well below its optimal maintenance standard before the strike campaign began because Western sanctions had disrupted the supply of specialized refinery maintenance equipment, catalyst chemicals, and the engineering expertise required for complex repairs. That is the baseline. Now, overlay the damage from successive precision strikes against facilities that were already operating with degraded maintenance cycles, and you arrive at a repair challenge that is categorically different from what Russia faced in any previous period of this war. The equipment required to rebuild damaged fractional distillation units does not exist in Russia at the scale needed. The specialized steel, the high temperature valve assemblies, the instrumentation, these are items that were previously sourced from Western suppliers who are now under hard sanctions. Russia cannot replace what is being destroyed at the rate it is being destroyed. That is not an assessment. That is an industrial reality. Now we reach the decision that changed the strategic geometry of this campaign, the operation that marks the clearest before and after line in the strike arc so far. When Ukrainian forces conducted the most ambitious deep penetration strike operation of this phase of the conflict, a coordinated multi-vector attack combining long-range drones, cruise systems, and fast-moving strike packages against a cluster of strategically vital oil processing and storage facilities in the southern and central Russian rear, the operation was not merely an attack. It was a statement of operational philosophy. It demonstrated that Ukraine had achieved something specific, the capacity to conduct combined arms strike operations at strategic depth, synchronizing multiple delivery systems across a target complex designed to achieve effect through simultaneous engagement rather than sequential strikes. That distinction is critical. Sequential strikes allow defenders to respond to each attack individually, to reposition air defenses, to isolate burning sections of a facility, to redirect response resources to the most critical points. Simultaneous engagement across multiple target nodes denies that response flexibility entirely. The defender must be everywhere at once. And Russia's air and civil defense architecture, designed for sequential threat management, calibrated for Soviet-era threat envelopes, was not built for this. The results were not symbolic. Multiple storage facilities sustained catastrophic damage in the first strike wave. Secondary explosions, the chain reaction detonations that occur when fuel stores are ignited in proximity to pressurized processing equipment, extended the damage footprint well beyond the initially engaged structures. And critically, the air defense responses that Russia managed to mount against the inbound strike package were, by the indicators available, partially effective at best. Intercepts occurred, but the intercept rate against the full strike package was insufficient to prevent the primary effects. And that insufficiency is itself a data point of enormous strategic significance because it tells you something specific about the state of Russia's layered air defense, that at extended range, against a mix of low observable and fast-moving delivery systems operating in coordinated timing sequences. The system is reaching the limits of its interoperability, the ability to hand off threats between radar networks, to prioritize among simultaneous inbound vectors, to maintain a coherent tactical picture against an adversary that has specifically studied and specifically targeted the seams in Russian air defense geometry. Russia's response to all of this has been, at the doctrinal level, revealing. The public posture has been dismissive. The claim that fires were quickly extinguished, that damage was minimal, that operations were unaffected. Those claims are contradicted by satellite imagery, by independent monitoring of fuel market prices in affected regions, by the observable drawdown of military fuel reserves I mentioned earlier. The private response has been significantly more panicked. Reports from Russian military-industrial channels, the semi-official commentary networks that carry sanctioned messaging from within the defense establishment, have included language about the unacceptability of the current threat level to rear area infrastructure and explicit calls for additional air defense deployments to facilities that were, until very recently, considered secure. When a military establishment starts publicly lobbying for air defense protection of assets it previously defined as outside the threat envelope, it is not projecting confidence. It is documenting its own failure of anticipation. What you are watching is the terminal arc of a strategic miscalculation that dates to before the war began. Russia built a military campaign around the assumption of Ukrainian operational fragility, the belief that Ukraine would exhaust itself, that Western support would fracture, and that Russia's economic and geographic depth would ultimately make it invulnerable to the kind of sustained escalating pressure that Ukraine is now bringing to bear. Every one of those assumptions has failed. Ukrainian operational resilience has exceeded every Russian projection. Western support, while imperfect and sometimes frustratingly slow, has continued to develop the qualitative capabilities that enable the strike architecture now dismantling Russian infrastructure. And Russian depth, that cardinal assumption on which the entire strategic logic was built, has been reduced from a strategic asset to a shrinking buffer that is being consumed kilometer by kilometer, barrel by barrel, with each successive strike cycle. The verdict at this point in the campaign is not complex. Ukraine has not won this war, but it has fundamentally changed the terms on which this war continues. Russia can no longer assume that its economic infrastructure is safe. It can no longer assume that its fuel logistics chain is insulated from the battlefield. And it can no longer assume that time is uniformly on its side, that simply sustaining the war long enough will produce a favorable outcome, because the war is now reaching backward into the economic substrate that sustains Russian military power, and that substrate is not inexhaustible. History will record this phase of the conflict as the moment when the strategic envelope of this war changed permanently, when the operational logic shifted from attrition at the front to systemic degradation at depth. What it will not record as clearly, because it is still unfolding, is whether Russia can adapt its logistics, its industrial throughput, and its air defense posture fast enough to stabilize the damage cascade before it reaches a threshold of operational consequence that begins visibly affecting frontline capability. Based on everything we have examined today, the repair constraints, the budget pressures, the air defense limitations, and the trajectory of Ukrainian strike development, the honest assessment is that Russia's adaptation window is narrowing. And the question that this channel will be watching closely in the weeks ahead is whether the next phase of this campaign extends the target set further, deeper, or at a tempo that prevents Russian recovery from what has already been done. Because if the answer to any one of those three vectors is yes, and the indicators suggest it could be all three, then what we are watching is not just an oil fire. It is the beginning of something that changes the arithmetic of this war at a level that will be very difficult for Moscow to reverse. Stay with this story, because those answers are coming,